Now, I want you to keep in mind the context of this book. He's speaking to Jewish Christians who have dispersed from Jerusalem, according to Acts chapter 8. So they're all spread out amongst within the Roman Empire. Now, these Jewish Christians, these are Jews who converted to Christianity. In the process of converting, they lost everything. They would have been ex-synagogue according to the Gospel of John, because the Pharisee says if anyone claims that Christ is Lord, they'll be kicked out of synagogue, which means that they would have lost their business. They would have lost all their networking relationships. They would have lost their income. This is why the blind man's parents were unwilling to say that their son was healed by the blind man, because they're afraid of that consequence. So these are the people who actually are going through the hard cost of following Jesus. They've lost it all. And so it is natural to think, while you are suffering this much, is it worth it? Like, why? Why is God allowing me to suffer so much? And the Pharisees and the rabbis don't seem to suffer at all. The Pharisees and rabbis are the rich ones, they're the privileged ones, they're the respected ones, and there seems to be no cost to them denying Jesus. Why can't I just go back to Judaism and become like a rabbi and elite? And that's the whole book of Hebrews is about. These are the Jewish Christians now in the book of Hebrews who are tempted to go back to their old way of life because they're saying this way of life is too hard. And so the author of Hebrews is telling them, no, don't go back to your old way of life. Yes, it's easier now, but you're going to give us something so much more important than temporary comfort. You're going to give up Jesus. And the whole book of Hebrews is Jesus is better. He's better than Moses. He's better than the angels, better than the Old Testament. The new covenant is better than the old covenant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the audience that James is talking to. So he knows the main thing that is on their minds, and it has to do with their trials. Now, let me start by defining the word trials. This is a very interesting word because in the Greek, the Greek word for trials, and later on in verse 13, temptation, is the same Greek word. So the translators are translating as trials here, and the same word they translate as temptation later. So here's the question. How do the translators know if something's a trial versus something's a temptation, right? It's the exact same word. Here's how. There's two factors when we talk about trials versus a temptation. The first question to ask yourself is, who is giving it? Because what we're going to see in verse 13, do you remember what James says? He says, God cannot what? Tempt you. So God doesn't give you a temptation, but he clearly gives you trials, right? So who is giving this event or whatever it is? If God is giving it to you, it's a trial. If Satan gives it to you, or if you are giving it to yourself through your desires, that's temptation. So from the outside, a trial and temptation can be the exact same thing. But it matters about the intention of why that thing was given to you. So here's a definition of a trial. A trial is something that God gives to you so that you can overcome it, become stronger in your faith, and more mature, right? We know that in the opening section of James. That's the purpose. He gives you a trial hoping that you would overcome it and pass the test. He's not giving you the test hoping that you will fail. Satan could give you the exact same test, but he gives it with the intention of you failing. Do you see the difference? So from the outside, that's why it's the same Greek word. If you lost your job, that could be a trial, that could be temptation. If God is the one that causes it or did it, it's a trial. He wants you to respond to it by overcoming it. He doesn't want you to respond to it and cause you to sin and go into deeper sin, right? His intention is for you to overcome and succeed and get stronger. But if Satan does this to you, his intention is for you to fail and to fall into sin. So the first question is, who is giving it? But here's a second question to ask yourself, is this trial versus a temptation? In a lot of ways, this is the most important one, because whether God is giving it to you or Satan is giving it to you, there's an X factor in all of this. How is your response? Meaning, God can give you a trial, but you could turn that into a temptation if you don't respond to that trial correctly. Does that make sense? Something that God intended to be a trial can turn into temptation if you don't respond to it with God's wisdom, but you respond to it your own way. Let's go back to the example of you losing your job. Let's say you lost your job. God wants that trial to cause you to lean on him, depend on him, right? But what if you respond by getting angry and you go out and rob 10 banks? What you've done now is you turn that trial into a what now? A temptation, because you allowed that event to cause you to sin. Now, if Satan gives you temptation, it doesn't mean you have to sin. Remember 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, every temptation is common to man, right? No temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man, but God gives a way out of every temptation. Let's say the greatest example. Jesus was tempted, was he not? But he turned that temptation into a what? A trial. Something that's meant to be a temptation, you can turn into a trial based on your response. So you can resist temptation, take the way out, according to 1 Corinthians 10:13, and then it became a trial that you overcame that strengthened your faith. Or God can give you a trial, but you respond wrongly, and you allow that to become the temptation for you to sin. So whether God gives it to you or Satan gives it to you, it's really irrelevant in a lot of ways. Because you can spend all days like, is this a God thing? Is this a Satan thing? It doesn't matter. What matters is this. How are you going to respond to it? Whether God's the one that made you lose your job or Satan's the one that's doing it, either way, the point is God wants you to respond a certain way. Whether God's the one that places a difficult person in your life or is Satan that created your baby to be the Antichrist that ruined your life, either way, it's how are you going to respond to it, right? Do you see that? The only thing you can control is this, number 2, your response. Because whether it's a trial or temptation, you can respond rightly or you can respond wrongly. So that's why James starts with trials. But if you fail the trial, fail the trust, fail the treasure, that trial turned into a what at the end? A temptation. You see that? It's like the evolution of sin. Something that should have been a trial that you overcame, because you didn't respond to the trial the way God wanted you to, it eventually becomes a temptation where you fall into sin. So, let's look at this trial a little closer now. So how are you supposed to respond to trials then? Whether it's, God gives you trials. He gives you a test. He allows you to suffer, but he doesn't want you to sin. He doesn't want you to respond in a way that will cause you to sin. So how do you respond so that it doesn't lead to the temptation? Look at verses 2-3. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Now we know the thesis of the book is verse 12. That's where he's working up towards. And the whole point of all these trials and tests is for you to become steadfast. That's the point. The word steadfast in the Greek means to stand up under a weight. He wants to grow your capacity to shoulder heavier weight. Think about going to the gym and working out. If you never worked out, you can't do 300 pounds right away. You start with small weight. But you're not supposed to just stay with that small weight over time. You what? You add a little more weight. You add a little more weight. You add a little more weight until you get stronger, stronger, stronger. That's the same way with the spiritual life. God's going to start with the trial. You look in hindsight, you're going to be like, that wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal to you at the time. Once you pass that, he's like, okay, Andrew, you got that? Let me add more weight. Let me add more weight. Let me add more weight until you reach your limit, right? And you're like, okay, now I really need help because I can handle this person, I can handle this person, but I can't handle this person. I could manage living with this income. I could lose half of this income, but I can't live on this income, right? Or it's okay when my health looks like this, but when I get terminal illness, now this is becoming a problem. Do you see that? This extra weight is being added to you. That's the purpose of the trials. And do you notice James says that you are going to meet trials of what? Various kinds. His way of saying anything and everything in your life can be a trial. Because the point is not for you to compare whether your trial is different or the same as someone else's trial. Everybody's trials are going to be different because every trial is unique to you. Because what is the point of why God gave a trial? Is for you to grow in your faith. You might need to grow in an area that someone else might not need to grow and vice versa, right? So you might find yourself with a certain trial over and over again. You might, well, how come this person never encounters that? That doesn't mean that person doesn't go through trials either. They just have their own unique trials that they need to grow in as well. You might struggle with materialism, so he keeps giving you that same lesson over and over again. But you might not struggle with alcohol, and this person might. You see the difference? You might struggle with lust, and this person might not, but this person might struggle with addictions and other, right? Trials are unique to you. And so James is not saying this is a trial, this is not a trial. He says there's trials of various kinds. Even good things can become a trial. Is marriage a good thing? It's very quiet in this room. It started off as a good thing, right? It's supposed to be a good thing, right? But is a marriage a trial sometimes? Absolutely. Sometimes it's like you're living with your enemies, right? Are kids a good thing? Well, it depends on the day, right? You ask me today or tomorrow, right? They are a gift, but they're a trial too. Is doing ministry a good thing? Depends. It can, but it could be a trial as well. Are they a blessing? Sometime, right? Do you start to see how it's hard to define trial as bad, this is good? Anything could become a trial. Something good could become a trial at some point. Having a good job is a good thing, but that could even become a trial at some point. You see, trials are anything that reveals to you where you are lacking in your faith. That's what a trial is.